You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that had, has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Finding Genius podcast. I have a great guest today, Dinesh Thakur. I heard about him after listening to an interview on Dr. Peter Attia's podcast with a journalist named Catherine Eban. And Dinesh Thakur figured prominently in her story about generic drugs and how a lot of them are made overseas in India and other places. And they're not made, to put it lightly, up to snuff, up to spec. And the FDA, is supposed to weigh in and protect consumers, but there's a whole murky mess, it seems, with generic drugs. And Congress in the United States pressures to get generic drugs that are affordable, and just the whole medical system seems to be a big old mess. And Dinesh was caught up in it. So, Dinesh, thanks for coming. If you don't mind, can you give just a very abbreviated version of the story? How did you first encounter troubles with generic drugs, and how did it go from there?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Richard, for having me on the podcast. So this is, I think, a story has been told many times over now, and especially with the book. But basically, I had an opportunity to go to work for a very large generic drug company that's based in India, after having worked in the U.S. In the large pharma for almost a decade. And when I got there, through serendipity, I found out that a lot of what they were doing in terms of data that was submitted to the US FDA to secure marketing approvals for their products in the US market was essentially made up. They hadn't followed the process and the practice of actually testing, the drugs that they were making. And in many cases, they were fraudulently making up data. And so when I found that out, obviously, I tried to alert the management in the company to try and, in the hope that they would actually try and fix it. Unfortunately, that just didn't go the way that me and my manager at that point in time wanted. And both of us essentially quit. And then I kind of worked with the US FDA for, almost 8 years before the company pled guilty to 7 counts of criminal felony and paid $500 million in fines. And this was back in 2013. But more importantly, what this did, while the Office of Criminal Investigations of the U.S. FDA was investigating this case, it opened up the U.S. FDA to this completely different way of thinking about the kind of fraudulent activity that actually goes on in overseas manufacturing. And, it essentially came under this large umbrella called data integrity. If you think about it, the way that the US FDA, which is the health regulator for our country here, assures that our drug supply is safe is largely based on paper inspection. So the way the process works is that, pharmaceutical companies that want to sell a product, whether it's a drug or a device, to patients in the US, they basically have to secure an approval from the regulator, which is the US FDA, saying that,
right,
their product essentially has a better risk, a better benefit compared to the risk that it offers, right? Any chemical or biological entity that you put in your body has a risk associated with it. And what the FDA does is basically say that the risk that this particular chemical entity has, it's smaller than the benefit it actually provides, right? So that's the evaluation that the US FDA does. And the vast majority of the evaluation is actually done by review of paper. It's about information that the companies provide to the US FDA in terms of how they, manufacture the product. What kind of testing do they do in order to make sure that the drug actually works?
Right.
What is the safety profile for this? Just to give you a simple example, if you have a headache and there's a medicine for that headache, you would not sort of want that medicine to give you, for example, extreme rashes, right, or your skin becoming brittle. But compared to that, if you're undergoing chemotherapy, if you for cancer treatment, and one of the side effects of chemotherapy is that your hair essentially thins out. Now, you don't want your hair to fall out when you're taking medicine for headaches, right? So clearly, right. the risk there is not acceptable for the kind of benefit that the drug offers to you, alleviating your headache. But the risk of hair falling out may be acceptable if you're undergoing chemotherapy and essentially taking radiation, right? So it's a question of balancing the risk versus the benefit of what this particular drug offers you. And a vast majority of this is done through documentation. Even when the inspectors that the FDA has go out there and make inspections, a lot of this is based upon a review of what the company says that it is doing in order to produce a product. And by and large, the system worked very well when majority of our drug supply was manufactured within the United States, because the inspectors would just kind of show up unannounced and basically say, look, we want to inspect your facility. We want to see how you do all of the processes that you think that you've told us that you would do. Well, right. That's not that easy to do when, a facility is located halfway across the world, right? First of all, you need visas to go to that country. Second of all, you don't know the language. You don't know the lay of the land. And many times, these companies essentially get way, ahead notice, like 6 to 8 weeks of notice, basically saying that there's going to be an inspection scheduled. So, they'll just clean up their act. Yeah. So that was what was happening. And, this case basically opened up a Pandora's box to the US FDA, basically saying this is a real problem. And so while, this case was essentially kind of, prosecuted, the Congress essentially gave the US FDA authority to conduct similar inspection to what it did internally within the United States, for the facilities located, in India and China, which basically supply the vast majority of our drug supply. So if you think about, volume of prescriptions that are actually filled in the country, I know that, vast majority of our conversation is always focused on price, and rightfully so, right? Because some of these medicines are extremely expensive. But if you think in terms of just the volume of medicines that we consume, 80% of the prescriptions that are filled in the country essentially is manufactured outside the country. So,
well, you know what really bothered me is that in the book it said that hundreds of thousands of people would go to their doctors in the U.S., for instance, and say, "Doctor, I don't feel well. Where this medicine's not working," and the doctor would say, "Well, they're all the same, and it must be in your head." Yeah. That's terrible. Yeah. If I have to take 100 milligrams of X for my heart, and because I'm getting generics, 1 month I'm getting the equivalent of 0 milligrams, and the next month I get the equivalent of 1,000 milligrams, it could kill me. It certainly is not going to treat me properly, but that's horrible.
It is, but the thing is, you think about this, right? So for a very long period of time, our regulator, the US FDA, has done such a good job of convincing all of us that a genetic equivalent, that once they approved, it's supposed to work exactly, identically to a branded drug, right? So this is what the US FDA has already told us. It keeps repeating this. If you look at, when Dr. Gottlieb was the commissioner of the US FDA a couple of years ago, they actually ran a very big campaign trying to demonstrate therapeutic equivalence between branded drugs and then generic drugs. And, this is something that the US FDA does because, in their opinion, once they give approval to a particular drug, it is supposed to work in the way that the original innovative drug is supposed to work. But in reality, that's not the case. I mean, if you go back to their USFDA's own, data about recalls, thankfully, they publish all this information on their dashboard, right? And if you look at the number of recalls that have essentially, been piling up over the last couple of years, you have to ask yourself, well, why are these things being recalled, right? Yes, statistically, you will have some issues, right? Even your car may have recall because an airbag is not functioning properly, or something's wrong with, your brakes or whatever. But statistically, if you think the number of recalls that we are seeing, and just in sort of last year, I can tell you about this medicine that is used in the cardiovascular area. It's called valsartan. We've been taking it. There are millions of people who take this medicine, and we only recently found out that there are trace amounts of rocket fuel in this medicine, in the way that it's manufactured, in India, based on material that they source from China.
That's crazy.
And that to happen because a small pharmacy based in Connecticut started testing, their product. Because USFDA does not test anything that comes into the country. We only look at a piece of paper and basically say, well, the manufacturer which is doing this is basically, saying it's okay. So we will basically accept their word for it.
Well, I have a question here. That's it's funny. When I was reading the book and listening to the interview, I thought these companies are going to so much effort to obfuscate and to get away with it. Like, why don't they just do it right? Is it that much more costly an effort to try to do it right? Why don't they do that?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And I think that that's a question that needs to be kind of, we need to peel the onion a little bit to answer this, right? Because vast majority of conversation when it comes to prescription medicines, focuses on price. We always talk about how expensive the EpiPen is, or the most, recent sort of, medicine that it's been approved for HCV or HPV. I mean, there are thousands of dollars, right? But if you think about, for example, the normal medicine that you take, maintenance medication, whether it's for your diabetes or for your heart condition, a typical $30-day prescription is filled at, at a copay of what, $10, $15, right? So, if you think about it, the per unit cost of that, it's less than what you would actually pay for a piece of fruit. You go to your local, sort of grocery store and buy an apple, that's in Washington, how much do you normally pay? You pay about 75 cents to $1, right? But if you think about this pill that you're taking twice a day to maintain your blood pressure, and you're paying $12 to maybe $20 copay for 60 pills, how much is that, right? So, the market
isn't there a middle ground? Isn't there if a generic is, I don't know, 10 cents a pill and the brand version is $10 a pill. Isn't there a middle ground though?
There ought to be, right? But unfortunately, I think this marketplace has become very lopsided. Although we spend so much time discussing, the price of branded drugs, which rightfully are extremely expensive, we really don't pay too much attention to, the fact that there should be a lower threshold, for manufacturing and, to certain quality specifications of the generic drugs, right? The trouble, this has been written, over and over many, many times, is that there are middlemen called pharmacy benefit managers, the Express Scripts, the Medcos, and these guys essentially negotiate the lowest possible pricing for these manufacturers and still make, handsome money on how, what our copays are. So, what the manufacturers actually make at the end of the day, there is very little, sort of leeway for them if, for example, a batch of drug that they produce doesn't meet specification, So for them, the financial incentive to try and sell that is much higher than basically complying, because the cost of compliance is actually quite low today, right? Because you know that you can game that system. You know that you have the ability to sort of figure out when the inspector is going to come over from the USFDA. You know that how things actually work. You can try and game the system to try and fool those inspectors and get that batch of drug, which normally costs about $100,000 or $200,000, even if it failed, to ship it out, because that's too much of an investment for you, and your margins are not all that great. So. Unfortunately, the marketplace isn't, working the way it ought to work when it comes to, vast majority of the prescriptions.
Okay. And then you have other prescriptions, like, I've used an inhaler for, years and years and years, and I watched it go up and up and up, and it's the same branded one. I know the drug companies have to make money and they spend billions. I totally understand that, but why does that happen? Why does insulin or my inhaler go up 50x?
There is absolutely no reason for that. Insulin, as you mentioned, there is absolutely no reason for, the cost of insulin, which, same companies sell for, 1/10 or 1/15 of what they are charging in the U.S. the moment you step into Europe or into Canada, compared to what they sell in the United States. There is absolutely no reason for that to happen. But unfortunately, I guess, our system, the way that our patents work and our pricing works, a lot of this is something that we've wrote into it, right? I mean, we do not allow Medicare to negotiate prices, Part D prescriptions for us. So a lot of this is also the law, right? Companies take advantage of regulations in the way that they're actually set up.
Yeah, if a company raises the price of a drug higher and higher and higher, I mean, that would push for a black market in it, or that would push certainly for generics of that drug. So, I mean, they're contributing to the problem. I mean, it seems like, I guess, all actors in the system are contributing to the problem, either intentionally or unintentionally.
Well, the thing is that the generics actually become a player into the equation only after the patent expires, right? Until the patent is enforced, generics obviously cannot make a copy of that drug. And that's where pricing becomes really, really important. The moment you see, the product become generic, prices definitely drop. But then you also have to be aware of the fact that there has to be a threshold at the bottom, that you can't push it down so far down that the incentive for the manufacturers to still make money and make a good quality product goes out of the window. I mean, if you look at the US FDA's list of drug shortages right now, there are hundreds of drugs there was only one manufacturer, and that manufacturer had quality issues in manufacturing. And guess what? We have a problem on our hands because, we don't have enough supply of that drug. I mean, things are changing. There is a company now that's been set up for, to bring back manufacturing locally. Civica RX is beginning to ban manufacture vancomycin, which is one of the drugs that is used in hospital settings, and it was on a shortage list for a very, very long time. We have a very long list of injectables, the sterile injectables, right, that are on the shortage list. So, this is not something that you can try and sort of resolve in sort of one kind of situation, because there are lots and lots of moving parts in this area.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, now after hearing from you and the interview and the book and everything, you get paranoid, and then you look at the drugs you are taking. So what, as a consumer, like, what do you do? Can you look up online and see? I mean, it seems like there's no online, like for, if I go buy a supplement on Amazon, for instance, at least if there's 1,000 reviews that are positive of it, I'm probably pretty safe in taking it, maybe. But I don't see anything like that for, for drugs and for generic drugs. Like, is there such a thing, and what do consumers do?
So, no, you're right. You're absolutely correct that there isn't a consolidated source where somebody can go in and essentially sort of look up. And then it's for two different reasons, right? The one biggest issue that we have within our own laws is that our laws do not require pharma companies to disclose where they are manufacturing the drug. So, for example, next time you go get your prescription filled, you look up, the label that is, slapped on that, bottle that contains your pills. It has the name of the marketing company, the one that actually holds the marketing authorization in the United States, but it doesn't tell you where it was made. I mean, you remember a few years ago, we had a problem with pet food. We had melamine in our dog food, and that raised a lot of issues. And basically, the law was changed to say that, look, we need to have the location of manufacture when you go to Petco and buy, food for your dog, or you can. Well, guess what? We don't know where the medicine is made. There is no law in our books at this point in time that forces pharma companies to disclose the location of manufacturer. So the thing is, even if you wanted to, even if as an aware consumer, you wanted to actually go to the US FDA website and go and look up, the name of the company whose name is printed on your prescription and say, have they had any recalls in the past, right? Has the US FDA issued any warning letters to this company in the past because of all the nonsense that they do? Even if that information is available on the US FDA website, you just do not know where this company is making it. And without knowing that, you really don't, you're in no better position, because the same company may have a manufacturing facility in Ireland, in the European Union, or in China. And I think that the probability that the facility in Ireland may not have gotten any citations, either recalls or warning letters, but the one in China may have several of those. Without knowing where your product was made, as a consumer, you're really out of luck. There's nothing you can do about it.
Well, I guess the only thing you could do, unfortunately, is other people would be guinea pigs that are currently taking the medication and or canaries in the coal mine. All you could do, I guess, is go online and look at generic X and see if people have had problems with it. I mean,
So one of the things that is happening more and more is that hospitals are actually building these things, right? So I work very closely with Dr. Lieber, who is a senior cardiologist at the Cleveland Clinic. Now, the Cleveland Clinic has developed, what they call a blacklist of drugs based upon their own experience of their patients. Their formulary doesn't buy from specific named manufacturers. They just say that we don't want to get it from, the companies that they know that they have trouble with. Now, the trouble there is that, because we're such a litigious society, these hospitals don't make this list public. So the doctors know that, their formulary or pharmacy knows that they're not going to buy. I mean, so for example, one of the case studies that we've spent a lot of time on is this drug called metoprolol. It is, given to, it's essentially given to patients who have some very serious cases of cardiovascular disease. And, we have, many clinical anecdotes right now where, the generic version of this drug actually causes your kidneys to malfunction, that you retain more water, and then in the end you'll have to be put on dialysis to drain your kidneys. I mean, you feel really bloated. And we know that this drug manufactured by some specific drug manufacturers based in India has this problem, but the clinic will not make it public because at the risk of inviting a lawsuit from these companies, right? So it's not just that the information isn't there. It certainly is, but the thing is, we really have to find the right source to be able to find this kind of information, for the medicine that we're taking.
But how could the FDA not care or not take action? It's crazy. I mean, they're human too. Do they want to live in fear and have family and friends and all that die or suffer horrible complications from this stuff? Like, what's wrong with them?
Well, I mean, so there was a hearing, 2 weeks ago. I don't know if you saw this, but the House Energy and Commerce Committee subcommittee on FDA oversight, right? They conducted a hearing where the Government Accountability Office, the Director of Health at the GAO, and Janet Woodcock, who is the head of CDER in the US FDA, both of them were asked to depose and testify before the US Congress. And in that, hearing, I mean, the FDA basically has admitted that they are not as effective in conducting foreign inspections as they hoped that they would be. I mean, the authority for the FDA to conduct foreign inspections was given as a part of the regulation FIDASIA at the time Ranbaxy case broke in 2013. They've had almost 6 years worth of data, and the head of CDER at the FDA basically admitted in that hearing that their model of inspecting foreign facilities isn't working all that well. So I think things of this nature will bring some pressure on. I think one of the things that I try to do is try and educate my congressperson, my senator, and basically have them ask questions, when an opportunity like this presents itself, to get the FDA to take more proactive action. I mean, it's been 5 years of them doing this, right? If they themselves are admitting that what they're doing isn't working, well, something's got to give, right?
It hasn't given so far. I mean, it's just, how could a company, by the way, so I guess if a hospital says we're not going to use company X's drugs because we've had problems with them, why would a company even have standing to sue them? What are they suing them for?
Well, I mean, so,
defamation?
No, so majority of these issues, right, even when the FDA has a problem, let's say, for example, this has happened in the past. When the FDA goes out there to India and China and inspects, right, and they find out that the company was committing fraud, either in their documents or in the way that they're manufacturing the drug or in the way that they're using, for example, excipients and raw materials. I mean, I can give you very simple examples, right? For example, in the manufacturing process, you would need to use, distilled water, right? And if you don't do that, you have microbial contamination in the drug that you produce. And if the FDA goes out there and finds out that the water that they're using to produce a drug is not as clean, as specifications demand, that obviously puts public health at risk. And the FDA basically says, okay, you cannot, then sort of they gave them a warning and basically saying that you cannot do this, fix it, right? And so that's the extent to what the FDA can do in a foreign country, right? If the facility was here in the United States, the FDA has the ability to, for example, search and seizure, capability where they can essentially sort of seize the entire stock of what this company is actually making. Well, they can't do that. They don't have jurisdiction in a foreign land. When you're inspecting, a facility located in India, FDA has the ability to debar people who are registered practitioners in the United States. Well, they don't have the same jurisdiction in India, right? Or in China, for example, if you find that, a particular scientist or somebody in the management there is fudging data to release a substandard product to the United States, what are they going to do? There are some systemic issues that we have to worry about because, our drug supply has become global right now. We don't manufacture a vast majority of what we consume in this country as far as medicines are concerned, but the law is not caught up to it.
Well, to make it even worse, I think you mentioned, or the book mentioned, that active ingredients could be changed and the components of a drug may be made in multiple factories and then combined, so it'd be impossible to figure it out.
Yeah, of course.
Well, again, what can people do? What's your recommendation as an average consumer?
Well, at this point, there are two things that you can do. One is to try and educate yourself. Thankfully, the FDA has a lot of this information available on their website through the FDA dashboard. You can just go to the usfda.gov and look for the inspections dashboard. List all kinds of information about recalls, about warning letters, about import alerts. Number one. Number two is, educate yourself and go talk to your doctor. If you don't feel well after taking your medicine, right, bring it to your doctor's attention that this is a real issue. Don't kind of dismiss it saying that it's all in your head, right? Third is to write to your local, congressman, congresswoman, and senator and basically say that this is what is happening. I mean, I live in Florida. We have a very large elderly population, and this is what I do. I mean, I spend a lot of my time trying to educate, my representatives so that they understand that this is a real issue among their constituents. I think the more, we try and reach out to our representatives, they at least begin to ask questions, and that's how the law changes, right? I mean, one of the things that I keep lobbying, to all my congressional representatives is just to make one simple change to make sure that these companies disclose the location of manufacture on the label of my prescription drugs. Just make that one change to the current regulations, right? So that it empowers me as a consumer to make better informed choice.
Right. Well, even today, I mean, I read in the book that, you even went to like the Indian government and you just got blowback from everybody. So is it still the case? Have things magically changed, or is it just still deny and nothing's going anywhere?
Well, I mean, look, these things don't happen overnight, right? It takes a long time to try and effect any change because the amount of money involved in this, whether it's here in the United States or whether it's in India, where I'm also very active in terms of trying to change the regulation. It's the same issue there because the industry is really powerful and there's no incentive for them to change anything. So to try and effect, change in their regulations, which I think is, it's going to be extremely important if our drug supply improves here, that India actually begins to enforce its own regulations more stringently, right? I mean, think about it. Like, for example, when our FAA, right, it doesn't go to India and inspect Air India aircraft when it takes off from Delhi to land in Newark, right? It relies on its counterpart in India to ensure that the equipment is safe, the pilots are well rested, and they comply with our regulations, right? That's the way the model actually works. Because if the FAA basically said, well, we're going to open up offices in every country, wherever, from where a flight originates to land, within in JFK or San Francisco or Los Angeles, we just wouldn't be able to do that. We really need to hold, these foreign regulators to account.
They still can do something. It seems like they just say, oh, well, they're in another country, there's nothing we can do. I mean, when a drug enters this country, why can't you test 1% or 0.1% of each lot or 1/100%, something? I don't know.
Yeah, so that may very well be that's the next step. If the regulations change, that may be the way that the things go. In fact, because the FDA doesn't do that, There are pharmacies like Valashore, based in Connecticut, that are beginning to do that. They're basically testing every lot of the drug that you buy through them for the same money that you would go to a CVS or a Walmart or a Walgreens to get your prescription filled. One of the things that they do is that once the drug comes into the country, they test every lot of that drug before it's released to their consumers. So, I mean, either the government actually does it.
I'm just talking about like a percentage of testing. How do they do that? How does Valashore do that and still make money?
So, I mean, I think that, the vast majority of these things are essentially sort of the pricing of these, as I mentioned to you, the vast majority of the money is in the middlemen, the pharmacy benefit managers. Now, if you eliminate the pharmacy benefit managers, if a third-party pharmacy is able to directly procure through a large contract from the manufacturers and then do the testing, they can still meet the current copay standards. PBMs are traditionally a black hole. There is very little in the way of transparency in the way that they work. And the rebate model and the average wholesale price that they use to negotiate on both ends, the retail end and also the manufacturing end, it's a complete, sort of opaque system, for us. And that's partly the reason why our medicine costs are so high. So these companies, essentially, like Valashore, they're trying to essentially, sort of work around that to say that you can still make money by testing this, every lot of the drug and supplying them to the patients. I mean, they don't do it for every drug. Obviously, there's the portfolio is growing, but, they do it for certain, like, for example, widely used drugs like cardiovascular drugs or diabetes drugs.
Well, what would happen if a senator tried to propose a bill to totally reform the prescription drug portion, or at least the pharmacy benefit managers? They try to, I mean, do you think they would just get blown to pieces, or do you think that, like, what would happen?
I mean, how many election cycles have you been, hearing about cost of prescription drugs?
Yeah.
So, it's not an easy, I mean, look, on the Hill, Capitol Hill, the two biggest lobbies are the gun lobby and the pharma lobby. Spend a lot of money, lobbying, our lawmakers to try and preserve the status quo, which essentially sort of, gives them the incentive to try and make more money.
Yeah. I was going to go back to consumers for a minute. We kind of talked about this very briefly, but if the FDA, so if you're relying on looking at FDA inspection reports, I mean, what else can you do? There's got to be something else. I mean, I guess one thing is try to afford the branded version if you can. I don't know if that keeps you safe. Like, what's been the experience with branded versions?
I don't know. So even branded companies, I think what happens is that they use the same manufacturing facilities overseas. But what happens is that with the branded companies, because they have a lot to lose, right? In terms of their reputation, they do their own testing before they do release it to the market, and that is the difference between what happens with many branded drugs, because they also outsource manufacturing to the same manufacturing facilities that they do this for generic drugs. But I'm not saying that we should only be using branded drugs. That is not a solution. We don't want to make it more expensive for patients. That is not the issue at all. I think what we need to do is fix the problem that we have, right? And we know we can fix this. This is not, something that is an unfixable problem. It just will take, a lot of political will to fix it, and enough people to stand up and say that there is a problem. As you said, the biggest thing that we have right now is our own healthcare providers, right? They basically don't believe that there is a problem. The patient goes to the doctor and says, look, doctor, my drug is not working. 9 out of 10 times they are told, guess what? It's all in your head. Or let me write a different prescription for you, right? A different generic prescription for you, without going into the root cause of why is it that particular prescription is not working, because doctors and nurses don't have the time to investigate.
Yeah.
Right? So part of this is also building consensus and then trying to make this as a viable issue within our lawmakers, right? So that they pay attention to this.
Well, what's even worse, in the book, they talked about if you're not in the U.S., in some of these countries in Africa or other countries, third world countries, they get even worse stuff. They just get garbage. And there's no point in even giving them drugs because there's nothing, like, that's awful.
Unfortunately, that is true. I think, these same companies that manufacture for global markets, what they do is take a lot more leeway when they make drugs for, markets that they know the regulatory oversight is not all that great, right? For example, if you go into any of the third world countries, their regulators aren't as equipped as the US FDA is, or the European Union EMA is, or the British MHRA is, because they know that, they are not as capable. They don't have the same resources that some of these regulators have. They, essentially, for them, it's a cost of doing business. You to try and beat the system as long as you possibly can. And I've seen that firsthand in many, many occasions.
Well, for the other countries, if they're going to make garbage, why don't they just make sugar pills? Like, why wouldn't a company just literally just encapsulate like nothing, harmless nothing, and just call it whatever drug they want, label it however they want, and then they'd even further maximize the money they make? Why not do that?
Well, so there are two issues, right? So this issue has been studied, quite well in the area of malaria. See, malaria is a tropical disease. We don't deal with it in this country, but it's endemic in tropical countries, and there is a lot of literature in terms of what really happens with malaria. We have to understand, when you're talking about things outside of the U.S., right? There are two different buckets that you have to worry about. One is counterfeit, the other is substandard. So, for example, Novartis makes this drug called Coartem, which is Novartis's drug. It's actually a very good drug to treat malaria, but it's expensive, right? And what happens, in places where malaria is endemic, which is like Southeast Asia, India, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, or in Central Africa, is that, this drug is counterfeited, basically, meaning that, you make your packaging, you make your, look like Novartis' stuff. So that essentially is counterfeiting stuff, right? Jesus. And then, you have medicine that, for example, that comes from an Indian company that makes, artemisinin, which is another drug that treats malaria. There, nobody knows that company as well as perhaps Novartis' name is, right? So, for example, you don't really have to make it, all the effort to even make it pretty, make it look like Novartis' drug, make sure that the pill looks like, for example, most pills have some kind of branding on it, right? It has some letters on it. It's got, some demarcation to make it look like, it's a genuine thing. They don't even make that attempt anymore. So, outside of the United States, the problem becomes a lot more complicated because you not only have counterfeit drugs, but you have substandard drugs as well. At the end of the day, it's a patient that gets essentially affected because neither of these ones, substandard or counterfeits, actually deliver therapeutic value, right? So WHO does a lot of work in this area. McDeeds and his team, work a lot in the counterfeits area, but this is a global problem. You don't have that issue in this country because, our regulator is very good. To the extent, I'm qualifying that by good by saying that they are very stringent in what they do. But in countries where you don't have good regulatory agencies, this is a much bigger problem. Yeah.
Well, I have an idea. What if, a company's drug is about to go off patent, but they made a law where the company can still earn, a small licensing fee, but they would disclose exactly how they make it and everything. And that would be the required method of making it for all the generics. That way the company would still make some money and the generics wouldn't have to try to figure it out blindly how to make this thing. And that may improve generics,
Yeah, so that exists today. Those are called authorized generics, right? So authorized generic is essentially a generic company that works for the innovator company, who the innovator company teaches its recipe for making the drug. But the point here is that what happens is that, even if you are an authorized generic that sells your product at a deep discount to what the innovator does, after 6 months of the patent expiry, the market basically says that you can have as many as 10 or 12 different companies come in. Now, if you have 10 or 12 different companies who are standard generic companies and they drive the price down to such a level that the authorized generic becomes then more expensive, right? So, the market dynamics here are also a problem in the way that the Hatch-Waxman Act works, which was enacted in 1980s essentially to bring in competition. At that point in time, the idea was good, but now we have got 30 years worth of economic and competition-related data that tells us, how this thing actually should work or does work or is not really working. There is actually a good sort of economic argument for what you're suggesting. But again, it has to be thought through from a policy point of view and how do you build that, into regulatory framework.
So what are your
Right.
thoughts going forward at this time? Do you think there's going to be any major improvements or
Yeah.
changes? Like what do you honestly see is happening?
So, I mean, I think that, as I said to you, I think that the most important thing for us is to bring this issue front and center, right? So, for example, one of the things that the FDA has done is it has looked at its criteria for approving generics for what are called narrow therapeutic index drugs, right? These are drugs that, even a small change in the active ingredient causes a lot of trouble. Anything to do with, for example, central nervous system, so anything to do with mental health, anything to do with, epilepsy, Alzheimer's, mood disorders, any of these drugs, there has to be a much tighter control on how we, what kind of standards that the generic companies have to meet in order to get the product approved. So in the last couple of years, the FDA has actually tightened this regulation on that aspect of it, which is a good thing. Second thing, what is happening is that this attention that the Congress is bringing to ask the FDA about these questions is actually a good thing, because once the most recent GAO report comes out, something will have to change within the FDA, right? They cannot plead that, we'll continue doing the same thing over and over again and still expect, not to be as effective as possible, right? There are hearings that are actually, happening in the U.S. Congress right now. Perhaps there's going to be more, in February. But the hope is that those hearings will lead to even minor changes in the law, things like disclosure of where our prescription drugs are made to be on the label. Those little things will go a long way in sort of bringing transparency into this particular process. The third thing is this whole notion about negotiating prices, like the role of PBMs. That will have to be studied, into a greater detail. I mean, we don't allow Medicare to negotiate, which I think is silly because every other country in the world does, right? So we'll have to think about, those things as well. And these are all, moving parts, right? It's not like one part, if you address it, it doesn't sort of affect the rest of it. If you just touch one aspect of it, everything moves, right? So you'll have to kind of, do it in a way that preserves what we have, doesn't cause too much disruption in our drug supply, and still continues to provide good quality medicines, within our patient population.
Fair enough. Well, so Dinesh, I mean, I'm really glad you're here. I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. I mean, it's so important. It just affects everybody. What's the best? I'm sure you don't want to be besieged by people contacting you, but I mean, what's your parting advice? How can people learn more? Should they read Bottle of Lies? What's your recommendation for me?
My recommendation is if you can borrow a copy of Bottle of Lies from the library, please read it, because I think that it describes the reality behind our prescription drugs. If you'd like, I have a website that I write, when issues that I believe are kind of important for me to sort of articulate. It is DineshThakur.com. You can just go there and read what I write.
Again, the website name?
It's my first name, last name.com, DineshThakur.com. And then, I always respond to email whenever I get email. My email is listed publicly on that website, and I've always sort of tried to do my best in responding to the questions that I get.
Well, Dinesh, as they say, you're a good man, Charlie Brown. And I appreciate you being here.
That's very kind of you.
I know you've had a hard time, and you've had criticism from everywhere, and it's never stopped and all that. And I just want someone to tell you, at least, for whatever it's worth, like, you're doing good things and you're doing hard things, but thank goodness there's people like you. So I appreciate it.
That's very kind. Thank you so much.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.